The great and powerful Trixie stood before her royal majesty Nightmare Moon. Only last week had she triumphantly returned from her exile, but already Trixie had risen through the ranks of prospective students and now stood before her. Trixie smiled and gave her a formal bow, which she had designed herself, of course, and rose to make a report. "My most gracious queen and mistress, I have just recently returned from Manhattan. The riot leaders have been dealt with, just as you ordered. Sadly, one of our members was mortally wounded." Nightmare Moon looked down from her throne, towering over the lowly unicorn. "Funny. I seem to have remembered sending a certain other unicorn with you, one who had shown as much promise as you. I dearly hope she wasn't our casualty." Trixie flourished again, avoiding the gaze of her master. "Sadly, my most regal mistress, it seems she let her guard down. An opportunistic citizen caught her while her back was turned. Though I tried my hardest to save her, she didn't make it." Trixie could barely hide her grin, but Nightmare Moon wasn't looking away. She smiled, knowingly. "Trixie, you have exceeded all my expectations, and proven yourself more than useful. Someone as great and powerful as you doesn't deserve mere riot control duties." Nightmare Moon's mane billowed out, encircling Trixie. "I hereby promote you to Royal Guard Captain, the first of my personal unicorn guardians, and the right arm of my will. Wear your armor with pride. Let all know that those who serve me faithfully are duly rewarded." The smoke cleared to reveal Trixie in all her glory. Her cloth wizard cap was replaced with a purple hood, and her flank guarded by an ornate black and purple saddle. She looked at her master and spoke her deepest thanks, but her eyes rested on the throne behind her leader, already knowing where her next ambition lay. Twilight and Dash sat in wooden chairs inside of a wooden building. A heavy wood desk sat in front of them, behind which there was an almost absurdly large wooden armchair. Sitting in the chair, cluttering non-stop, was Rarity. "And I must apologize again for these dreadful conditions, and I assure you that wood furnishing is the height of glamour these days. Oh, but how I've longed to see my boutique just once more. But, say it's been ruined? Oh, how dreadful. Please, some good news. Tell me again about hoity-toity, but skip the parts where I was crying this time. I simply cannot—" "Rarity, slow down. You're making my head hurt." "I'm terribly sorry, Rainbow Dash. The hustle and bustle of organizing the town gets to me sometimes. I just couldn't stop moving. Everything must be properly organized, for maximum efficiency. Of course, that's not to say that you can't add a bit of extra flair as you go, my dears. It keeps your spirits up, as well as it's worth the effort, if you ask me. Rarity, sorry to interrupt, but we only just—" "Oh, there I go again. I'm terribly sorry, you two. And only just after I finished explaining myself, too. How rude of me. Please, you were saying?" Twilight and Dash looked at each other uncertainly, not sure if the white unicorn would start up again. Then she simply sat there patiently. Twilight ventured a sentence. "Rarity, we've told you how we got here. Do you think we could stay here a while we figure out how to get home? Some of the unicorns here might be able to help me with the research as well." Rarity looked appalled, an exaggerated shock crossing her face. "But of course, my dear. Stay as long as you like. I'll find an open house for you immediately. One with a beautiful sight over town center." The unicorn paused for a moment, a sheepish grin crossing her face. "But, I hate to ask. You wouldn't be willing to lend a hoof to a few things while you're here, would you?" Twilight nodded to Dash, who smiled back. She gave Rarity a big grin, more than happy to lend her friend a hoof. "Rarity, of course we'll help wherever we can. It's only fair that we earn our keep." "Excellent. Now, let's see. Where will your special talents be most useful? Rarity lifted several pages of paper with her magic, shuffling through them at lightning speed. As she read each page, she simply discarded it haphazardly, and Twilight couldn't help but wince at the sight. After a few moments, Twilight had to interrupt her. Rarity? Perhaps I could help you there, if that wouldn't be too bold. I know I only just arrived, but it looks like you could maybe use someone to help with organization. Rarity froze and peeked out from behind a floating stack of supply lists, surprised. After a moment, though, her face brightened. Of course! How absolutely genius, Twilight! Spiken is an excellent aid, of course, but I could use someone in whom I can entrust a little more responsibility. I would be honored if you could work at my side. Twilight and Rarity both beamed at each other, and Dash couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. Here was Twilight again, fitting in perfectly as she led her way around this new world, and Dash was the odd pony out. The thought didn't last long, as Rarity turned to Dash quizzically. Not bothering with the papers anymore. And Rainbow Dash, let me begin with a long overdue thank you for saving our lives. Not every pony may know of your deeds firsthand, but Applejack and I wouldn't be here without you. And then, who knows where the survivors would have ended up? Oh, thanks, Rarity. But that wasn't really me. I'm not the same Rainbow Dash you knew. Oh yes, I know, dear. But you were until just recently before that, if I understand Twilight correctly. I know you would have made the same decision, but please, is there anything in particular you'd like to occupy yourself with here in New Ponyville? I at least owe you enough to let you choose where to lend your aid. Rarity sat with her hoofs together, waiting patiently. Dash thought for a moment. Anything to keep me up in the air, really. I just want to be able to stretch my wings. I guess you don't really have to worry about weather patrol down here, huh? Rarity shook her head, but smiled. No, but we do worry about Shadowbolt patrols. If you think you're up to it. Big Mac runs the guard ponies schedule for the whole town down at the guardhouse, and he'll probably put you in touch with one of his Pegasus lieutenants. Of course I'm up to it. I'm the best flyer in Equestria, remember? I could do simple patrol work in my sleep. Dash was quite hopeful at the idea of simply flying around all day. Considering how quiet her voluntary patrols had been, she even had a small bit of hope that she might be able to sneak in some trick practice during some quiet part of the night. Rarity squealed with joy and leapt clear over the desk, embracing both of her long-lost friends again. Now that that's settled, let me officially welcome both of you to New Ponyville. Zecora hummed quietly to herself as she returned to her hut. Fluttershy had returned to her own cottage after the departure of her friends for some very much-needed rest, and Zecora herself was getting ready to turn in for the night. She quietly doused the fire and boarded up the windows, letting herself sink into her mats to sleep for the day away. A few hundred feet away, a Pegasus watched the lights of the hut go out. Hopping off her tree branch, she floated to the ground in front of her captain. The captain turned her gaze from their own fire to listen to her report. Sir, the hut's gone dark. I estimate 40 minutes of remaining starlight before full day. Shall I set up our camp? The captain rose from her haunches and looked the mayor straight in the eyes. At least as much as the goggles would allow. Lieutenant, do you remember the orders I gave you when we set out on this mission? Puzzled, the lieutenant frowned. Actually, sir, you never technically gave me any orders. Exactly, Lieutenant. I did not order you to come here as your captain, because if I did, then you would be duty-bound to break into the hut and arrest the occupant for collaboration with a known fugitive. The captain's face scowled harder with every word. Fortunately, I asked you out here for a strictly recreational camping trip, during which we have unknowingly stumbled across a hut containing an innocent pony. Therefore, Lieutenant, I do not believe it is appropriate to address me as Sir, but rather as the purely coincidental, honorific title that accompanies my rank in the unrelated organization known as the Shadowbolts. The lieutenant smiled, ignoring the displeasure in the captain's voice. Of course, Captain. However, one cannot help but notice that when in a recreational situation where captain and lieutenant are not symbols of rank, one finds the chain of command slightly blurred. One might even demand some help from their companion with the tense. The captain glared at the lieutenant, but couldn't contain a small guffaw. After a moment, both ponies broke into a fit of laughter, the captain placing a wing around her friend. "Lieutenant, you were my second in command for nearly a year now. I hardly consider you as being under my orders, even when we are on duty. Come on, I'll help you set up the damn tents." As the ponies worked, careful to keep quiet, the lieutenant grew cautious and curious. "Well, Captain, since I can't technically be questioning orders, what the hell are we doing out here anyway? You only told me to meet you here with enough supplies for a few days." The captain pulled a rope taut with her mouth, hauling the tent frame into position. Once her mouth was no longer full, she began to reply. "Well, Lieutenant, here's the situation so far. Rainbow Dash and Twilight Sparkle were confirmed dead a few months ago. Yet, they were reported to have visited that hut yesterday and stayed there earlier, until tonight. The great and nosy Trixie got a mole in our ranks and heard about it, but she doesn't know about this place. Now, if that foal had her way, she'd already have arrested them both. But here we are with just the known location of the fugitive that has eluded capture for months, because we simply waited and watched." The captain pulled the canvas over her tent, setting it up expertly. "So, Lieutenant, I think that if we follow these ponies' trail, we can maybe learn one or two things about our missing fugitives. After all, the four of them were close friends at one point. Well, 6 now, I suppose." The lieutenant gave her tent an experimental prod, which caused it to immediately collapse. Sighing, she grabbed a pole in her mouth once more. Her tent being finished already, the captain trotted over to help her. Once the pole was set up again, the lieutenant continued her investigation. "Well, the ponies have already left, right? What are we doing here? Waiting for Fluttershy to return?" The captain grunted, pulling the canvas tight. "No, we know where Fluttershy is now. We can let Trixie take care of her later. Some pony else guided our targets into the woods, meaning the hut has visitors from somewhere else as well. We'll keep an eye out for them tomorrow. If nothing turns up, we'll go ask Fluttershy some more direct questions." Twilight opened her eyes, her body cloak telling her that regardless of what time of day it was, she had enough sleep. Twilight groaned, but knew from experience that she would not be getting any more rest, and rolled out of bed. While Rarity was trying to find them an open living space, Twilight was staying in the same building as Rarity. Rarity herself had a luxurious bedroom on the top floor of her office, while Twilight had a mattress in an unused storage room. "Well, at least it has a window," she thought, watching the mediocre torchlight pour in. "And it's only temporary." She walked to the door and opened it, taking the small hallway outside directly towards the main office. She heard a door open behind her and turned to see Spike stepping out of the hallway. Sleepy-eyed, he waved at her. "Spike, you're up awfully early. Actually, come to think of it, I didn't even know what time it is down here. How do you keep track?" Spike rubbed his eyes, and Twilight heard his stomach growl. "Hunger, mostly. Honestly, some part of the town is always awake, so time doesn't really mean much. Nobody bothered to bring a clock when they fled the town, but we have a few watches that used to keep track of important things. Right now, it's about 20 minutes before nightfall, I think." The dragon jumped, wakefulness coming to his face. "Speaking of which, I have to go. If I let my daily delivery from Fluttershy now, I can be back at 5 or 6 hours of night left. Rarity needed my help with something special tonight, so I'm going to get it done ASAP." With that, the little dragon rushed down the hall and out of sight. Twilight sighed and smiled at her young friend, then turned back towards the office. She also had some work to do. she knew, and it wasn't going to be easy. As she entered the office, she couldn't help but cringe at Rarity's mess. I can't believe she preaches about organization and efficiency in this catastrophe area, she thought. Truly, the place was a wreck, with papers and files overflowing from cabinets, and the floor area around Rarity's desk being layered in documents. Sighing, she finally began organizing the mess. It wasn't until several hours later that Dash woke up, having not slept for 36 hours before that. Stretching her wings and yawning, she jumped out of her bed and hurried over to the door, eager to start the new night. She had been assigned a makeshift shack used for new visitors who hadn't yet proper housing, and so there was little more for her than a roof and a bed. She opened the door and stepped outside, and found herself in the hustle and bustle of the town. Seeing 2 Pegasus ponies in guard uniforms flying overhead, she leapt into the air and followed them. Near the entrance that she and Twilight had used, a vaulted stone building had been constructed. Large windows with no glass in them lined every wall, and Pegasus ponies were constantly flying in and out of it. Landing on the ground in front of the building, Dash entered through the open archway, spotting a certain red stallion poring over a certain terrain map. Dash approached and saluted. "Rainbow Dash reporting in for duty, sir." Dash ripped off, doing her best military voice. Big Mac and the Pegasus next to him looked at each other for a moment, then let out a bellowing laughter, leaning on each other for support. "What? What's so funny, guys? It couldn't have been that bad, could it?" Recovering himself, the Pegasus next to Big Mac wiped away a tear. "I'm sorry. It's just that nobody has seriously done that in months. We just run patrols, miss, not an air force." He thrust a hoof forward. "I'm Soreen, formerly of the Wonderbolts. Nice to meet you, Rainbow Dash, and thanks for the laugh." Rainbow Dash's heart leapt into her chest. She hadn't recognized the Wonderbolt member without his uniform on, only meeting him for a few minutes at the Grand Galloping Gala. This version of Soren looked different anyway. Part of his face was scarred with what looked like a burn. Returning the hoof shake, she kept her excitement in check. After all, she was supposed to be the semi-famous hero in this world. Soren and Big Mac turned back to the map, which Dash could see now was covered in dotted lines. Soren turned back after a moment and said, "Okay, we've got a solo patrol opening up in just under 10 minutes. That will take you until dinner. After that, you'll fly with me, and I'll show you a more complicated route. Think you're up to it?" "Hell yeah, I am. No Shadowbolts are going to get through me." She paused for a moment, suddenly unsure of herself. Sir?" "All right then, Air Pony. Study your route and prepare for takeoff." He saluted sharply. "Dismissed, soldier." "Oh, Twilight, you're absolutely darling. This room has never looked better. You have done marvelous work, my dear. Truly marvelous." Twilight closed the last file drawer with her magic, turning her head as Rarity entered the office. There was still plenty of mess to be cleaned up, but the room was far more manageable than it had been a few hours ago. "Thanks, Rarity. I haven't had to seriously do this kind of thing since Spike came around, but it feels good to do it myself again. I labeled each drawer so you know where everything's at, but I think I'll need another filing cabinet, or 2, for some of these things." "Well, it looks splendid so far. Absolutely beyond expectation. I thought it would be a week at least before I could find my way through here again. But you've given me hope, darling. Tell me, is there anything I can have someone get you while you work? I'm on my way out again, but I can send a pony up with any food or drink you'd like." Twilight smiled, turning a new pile of papers. "That'd be lovely, Rarity. I could really use some lunch. Stuffing this much paper has taken a lot more out of me than I thought. Honestly, I didn't even know how you have enough wood left to print it all." Rarity smiled and waved her hoof dismissively. "Oh, well, I wouldn't really know. I'm sure the reports from the lumber ponies is buried in there somewhere, But who can be bothered to read such insane amounts of numbers when there are much more exciting events going on? The ponies like a charismatic leader, and I can't very well give them that if I'm stuck here reading reports all day. After all. Twilight halted and turned to Rarity, catching her eye before she turned to leave. You don't read the reports? Any of them? But then, how do you know what condition any of the town's projects or supplies are in? Why, I simply go and see the important ones myself. If you're that worried about them, my dear, give them a read if you like. I'm sure you'll have this place cleaned up in plenty of time to spare for dinner. Speaking of which, I'll have that lunch sent right up to you. And now I simply must be off. Goodbye, darling. With that, Rarity flourished and left, leaving a very worried Twilight behind. The captain munched slowly on her rations, leaning against the tree trunk. The bough she sat on shifted slightly under her weight, the old tree obviously close to collapsing. She stared through the maze of tree branches, listening to her companion break down the camp below. Nearly half the night was over, and she hadn't seen any sign of life but the hut, except for Zecora, leaving a few times. Each time, returning with a wrapped parcel. The captain was about to call down for a shift change when she spotted some movement in the trees about a dozen feet from the hut, and caught sight of a small purple dragon walking towards the building a moment later. She gave a low whistle. A moment later, her friend alighted slightly and silently on the branch next to her. They looked on in silence as the dragon entered the building for a few minutes, then left, wearing a heavy-looking backpack. Spike hummed quietly to himself as he trekked back towards home, never bothering to check the skies above him. Dash soared just above the tree line, encircling the town from the opposite. Her patrol route went all the way around the perimeter of the mountain above the town, and she was using the opportunity to get a look at the landscape. When she and Twilight had entered the underground settlement, they hadn't actually descended at all before coming into a cavern with a ceiling several hundred feet off the ground. Dash could see now that the spot where they had entered was only about 20 feet away from the steep side of a small mountain, not uncommon for this part of the woods. For miles around them, the terrain rolled off and dropped into hills, of varying sizes, making New Ponyville that much harder to spot. She flew up near the top of the mountain and estimated the height of the chamber inside. There's probably about 40 feet of stone between the top of the hill and the roof of the cavern, she thought to herself. But some of those walls can't be more than 5 or 6 feet thick near the bottom. I suppose Rarity knows what she's doing more than me, though. So if she thinks that's stable, I suppose it's stable. She finished her loop around the perimeter and turned back to the main entrance. She had a 15-minute dinner break, and then she would have to be back in the air, this time with a Wonderbolt by her side. But in town, Twilight was poring over lists of supplies, her dinner growing cold in her worry. She paced back and forth, using her magic to shuffle reports in front of her. She's thrown 2 feasts for the town this month, bringing storehouses down to 15% of maximum capacity, she thought to herself rapidly. She's ordered the construction of 6 new buildings, none of which are designed to accommodate more than a few ponies, despite the fact that lumber stores could barely produce one. Oh, by Celestia! Inspection teams reported that the cavern ceiling is covered in stalactites. But here she's ordering new tunnels, dog? Does she have no regard for safety? Twilight's head shot towards the door as the guilty unicorn walked through, her face beaming radiantly. Twilight, never in my wildest dreams could I have hoped for a more pristine office. Rarity, we need to talk about... You've truly outdone yourself, my dear. And I had thought that this would be your assignment for a week. But in a single night you have... Thank you, but please. Single-hooftedly ironed out every possible wrinkle in communication and coordination between myself and the ponies in town. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about, Rarity. Have you looked at these at all? You're giving out food faster than anyone can gather it. You're authorizing unsafe construction. You haven't checked the cleanliness of the town's only water source. Your use of raw materials is... Please, Twilight, I haven't gotten all day. Skip to the important bits. I'm sure there's something in there about how much the ponies of the town simply adore me. Rarity batted her eyelashes innocently, but this only served to make Twilight angry. Rarity, this is all important. You came here as refugees with enough food to last you 6 months, but it's all gone within 2. Within weeks, you will run out of food at this rate, and mushroom harvest teams already have to spread out for miles around the town to find groves of edible fungi. Fluttershy makes her own deliveries every day now, up from once a month, half a year ago. Twilight stomped her hoof for emphasis after each point, but Rarity seemed more bored than concerned. Honestly, Twilight, I don't see what you're so worried about. The town is happy. Everybody simply loves my leadership, and I've never had a problem feeding and clothing every pony in town. Rarity walked over to her desk and lay back in her chair, sighing contentedly. Twilight struggled to hold back her outrage. It's like I'm talking to a pile of hay, she thought to herself. Immaculately groomed hay that's too stupid to realize that it's just hay. Instead, she said, That's just it, Rarity. You've been feeding your citizens like kings for months, and all the food you have saved up is gone. You'll have empty storehouses within a week, and without strict rationing, every pony will starve within a month. At this, Rarity's face became shocked. Twilight sighed in relief, thinking she was finally getting through to her. Her naivety was shortly shattered. Rationing? Are you mad, darling? The ponies will never stand for it. And I've led so far with the attitude of generosity, always putting them before myself to make sure they had plenty. How can you expect them to love me if I take that away from them? Twilight stamped her hoof repeatedly, in frustration, getting the better of her. No, 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 no! This isn't about every pony loving you, Rarity. You have a responsibility as their leader to manage things like this. I'm telling you, this town will die if you don't begin a food ration immediately. Absolutely not, my dear. As long as I'm mayor, the town will live happily and contentedly, with warm buildings and full bellies. After all, I'm not the holder of the element of generosity. I'll go with only 1 meal a day, but I cannot ask the same of every other pony. Rarity seemed satisfied with this compromise with herself. Now, my dear, you've had a long day. You may, of course, have the rest of the night off, but I'll have a new job for you tomorrow. You've certainly shown you have an eye for logistics, so perhaps you can help me plan a new series of tunnels. We've had a small problem of petty theft recently, and I was thinking that some more prison cells would be in order. That's another thing I need to talk to you about, actually. The basic minimum safety... Not now, Twilight. I've had a long day as well. I'm expecting Spike back soon to help me plan a banquet for next week. I believe you wanted to use this time to research a way home, correct? Twilight began to speak, but Rarity was already pushing her out of the office. Good night, darling. I'll see you bright and early tomorrow night. The captain hovered silently around the tree, keeping the small dragon in her sights. She couldn't hear her, but she was aware of her lieutenant behind her and a bit above. Trailing the purple oaf had been simplistic, almost boringly so. He moved quickly despite his size, and the 2 Shadowbolts had taken care when crossing a river with minimal cover. But Spike never took any evasive movements or any steps to cover his tracks. The terrain was becoming hillier now, all the better to have a high vantage point without loss of objects to hide behind. Not far to their southwest, Rainbow Dash followed Soren out of the cave. She heard Billy Gruff cranking away behind her, followed by the crunching of stone on stone as the door sealed itself invisibly shut. Soren stretched his wings and glided lazily in the air, with Rainbow Dash following up close behind. So, how did you end up in Ponyville with the survivors? I know you're not from the area. Rainbow Dash berated herself for talking first. worried that the celebrity would think of her as just another desperate fan. Soren sighed, remembering back. Oh, yeah. Well, when the news of what was happening to Ponyville reached the rest of the cities, a lot of riots broke out against Nightmare Moon. I was in Manhattan at the time, visiting my teammate Spitfire, when one started there. I knew the city wasn't safe, and since the team was all but disbanded, anyway, I decided to fly down here and try to lend some aid. Poor girl watched her whole family die in those riots, but wouldn't accept my help even after that. While Soren talked, he alternated between scanning the ground and the skies. Rainbow Dash followed right behind, taking careful notes of his every move. Rainbow Dash was looking at his flying technique intently when she noticed something over his shoulder. A wicked idea formed in her head. Soren, hold up. I want to have a little fun. The Wonderbolt came to a halt in midair. Eh? This is kind of serious, Dash. But I suppose this patrol is usually pretty quiet. What did you have in mind? Rainbow Dash pointed to the unsuspecting Spike beneath them. I don't suppose you're a fan of pranks, are you? His grin gave her all the answer she needed. Okay then, follow me. She dove towards the ground, careful to keep out of Spike's line of sight. A rush of air behind her confirmed that Soren was following her lead. As she crept behind a large boulder, the path that the dragon was on would take him just inches from where they were hidden, and Dash could already see the look on his face when two Pegasus ponies leapt out at the speed of sound right in front of him. The lieutenant stayed parallel with her target, moving along his left side. Through the trees, she could see a faint movement of the captain shadowing Spike from the right. She had been doing this for hours, and simply follow the dragon. It had become boring. Subconsciously, she had long ago been playing a game with herself to see how close she could get to the dragon without him noticing. As the dragon slowed down, she moved in closer, edging away around a large boulder which lay just inches away from him. As she congratulated herself on her new record, her flank bumped into something. She turned around in surprise to see two equally surprised ponies, one of which was very familiar. Well then, she thought as she bucked out. So much for subtlety.